atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. My guest today is Les Leopold, co-founder and executive director of the Labor Institute, a nonprofit organization that develops and conducts education and policy programs for unions, environmental organizations, community groups, and immigrant worker centers on workplace health and safety, the environment, economics, and movement building. That's a lot. He's also the author of multiple books, and his latest is Wall Street's War on Workers: How Mass Layoffs and Greed Are Destroying the Working Class and What to Do About It, which we'll be talking about today. Les Leopold, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So I thought we'd start, longtime listeners know I love to start with titles of books, and it's a pretty provocative title, right? War on Workers. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what Wall Street has against workers and why it's at the level where it almost feels like a war on workers.
Well, there was a big shift in how our economy functioned starting at around 1980. At that point, the Reagan administration philosophy was to deregulate as much of the economy as possible, and that included deregulating the basically New Deal controls on Wall Street. That was then extended through the Clinton administration, and it became the way the world works. We refer to it as neoliberalism or financialization. But two key things happened. The first was that leveraged buyouts, using borrowed money to buy a company, became standard. Before deregulation, this was frowned upon. Now it was viewed as it's okay to do it. And when a company does that, when a corporate raider, we call them then, now we sanitize it, we call it hedge funds, private equity companies. They use, let's say 90% of the cost of the company's borrowed money. They then stick that debt on the company they just purchased. And to service the debt, you then lay off people. And layoffs, the reason I call it a war is that layoffs became a go-to function in good times as well as bad times. Previous to this, layoffs have been something that corporations were reluctant to do. Corporate managers viewed themselves as failures when they had to do layoffs. But recessions were the primary reason. Downturns in the economy were primary reasons for layoffs, and then people were hired back often. And some companies like IBM had guaranteed lifetime employment, so they didn't lay anybody off, good times or bad times. But with the deregulation, Wall Street now had the ability to use layoffs as a profit maximizing tool, and people became disposable. The second thing that happened was stock buybacks, which had basically been outlawed from the New Deal all the way till 1982, became legalized again. And stock buybacks are a very blatant form of stock manipulation. In economic theory, free market theory, no one corporation or actor is supposed to be able to manipulate the price of their own products. The market's supposed to do that. But with a stock buyback, a company uses its own resources, its own earnings, goes into the marketplace and buys back its own shares. And by doing so, it bids up the price of its own shares. Now, this becomes very valuable to Wall Street stock sellers, people who, investors and hedge funds, et cetera, who take a position in the company, buy up a bunch of the shares, pressure for a stock buyback, and then quickly sell the shares, make a bundle. And this also became important for CEOs because during this transformation period, this financialized transformation period, the way CEOs were paid got changed. It used to be salary, mostly salary and some bonuses. Then it became 95%, 90% stock incentives. So raising the price of the stock enriched the CEOs. And the way to pay for stock buybacks is layoffs, mass layoffs. And we've been able to document in the book that virtually every mass layoff has taken place, you will find a stock buyback in the background or a leverage buyout. So it's an undeclared war. You make money by inequality grows not just by siphoning off wealth and putting it in the hands of the top 1% or the fraction of the top 1%. It actually grows by pushing people down through mass layoffs. And that pushing people down through mass layoffs is what has not been talked about in the economic literature, political literature for the last 25 years. And our big discovery in the book, one of the two big discoveries is that mass layoffs has had an enormous influence on politics. This Wall Street war on workers has had a big influence. Just one little other note. I'm not the only person in the country that views it this way. Unbeknownst to me and unbeknownst to Sherrod Brown wrote a series of articles before the book was published called Wall Street's War on Workers. And he has one called Wall Street's War on Workers, stock buybacks. So he recognizes that something's changed in the financial sector that has basically open season has been declared on job stability. Something that corporate managers before 1980 would have been ashamed of. They felt it was their duty to keep people working, not to lay them off. Now it's a mark of a smart manager to be tough enough to lay people off.
I know that a lot of conservatives would hear that argument and their response would be something like this. Yes, you may be right. Even if they grant all your particulars, they would say, but we've been living in a different world since the 1980s, because from basically the end of World War II until the 70s, there was a lot less international competition. Technology and automation hadn't gotten to the place where you could ship things cheaply, you could outsource and offshore things. And so all of these things that happened in the financial sector, that happened with corporations, were a response to a far more competitive international environment. And you can't look back to the policies of 50s, 60s, and 70s and expect to reenact them, because that world is essentially gone and it's not coming back. And I know you've heard this argument before, so I'd like to hear how you respond to it.
Yes, I have not only have I heard this argument, I used to believe it. and it's one of the reasons why I wasn't paying close attention to the mass layoff phenomena. In working on this book, I came to realize that those arguments do not explain, they're not sufficient for explaining the phenomenon of mass layoffs. We estimate there's been 30 million mass layoffs since 1996. Now, we can back into this in a couple of ways. First of all, part of the financialization are the very trade agreements that didn't fall from the sky. NAFTA and China coming into the WTO were policies by the political establishment in Washington after 1980. These are the things that corporations were pushing for so they could take advantage of lower wage labor around the world. But let's just leave that as it is and say, okay, that's done. And now we're facing global competition. And isn't that, and new technologies that allow for it, isn't that what causes all these mass layoffs? Well, if that were the case, how is it that the Japanese can provide guaranteed annual income, guaranteed jobs, lifetime jobs in the auto sector, in an auto sector in which they lead the world in robotics, and they can provide this? How is that possible? How can they then compete globally? Well, they're doing quite well, thank you very much. And their wages are very good. Take a second example, and this is the one that turned me around in this book. Siemens. Siemens is a global German-based electronics company. They manufacture other things as well, not just electronics. They have 400,000 employees around the globe. 90,000 of them are in a spin-off that they set up called Siemens Energy. And in 2020, Siemens Energy decided to lay off 1,700 workers in the United States, 3,000 in Germany. And what happened in those two countries is what changed my whole attitude about the very question that you asked. In the United States, all 1,700 people were laid off. Those that had union contracts received severance and maybe some extended health care, but all those facilities shut down. They were making compressors for fracking, and they wanted to get out of that line of work. In Germany, something happened very different. They have co-determination there, something that the Americans kind of pushed onto German industry and labor after World War II. And co-determination means half the board seats are held by workers, i.e. by union representatives. The other half by financial interests and other corporate interests. And the board chair, the ultimate manager, is elected by the whole group, and then he's got the tying vote, or he or she has the tying vote. Well, what the unions did in that situation, they took advantage of and then they have all these joint committees up and down the food chain, at the plant level, at the regional level, and so on. They investigated the problem of the layoffs. And this took time and more time and more time. And finally, it came to an end. And the company agreed to the following. Two things that blew my mind. First was no compulsory layoffs. They would have to bid, basically, to get people to leave voluntarily. No one would be forced to leave. So someone close to retirement would take a package and leave. Others would say, no, we're staying. And Siemens was committed to then keeping them working somewhere. There were 6 plants that were supposed to go down. I think 7 went down in the United States. There were another 6 that were supposed to go down in Germany. And what they agreed to do was put a different product into those plants. Now, Germany is an export-driven economy. Siemens depends on its exports. Yet they were able to do those two things in an incredibly competitive environment, much more competitive than for U.S. industry. And what this taught me was that these large corporations are enormously flexible. They can move the chess pieces around easily. In the United States, another example, during the UAW negotiations, Stellantis, took over from Chrysler. They were going to shut down, before negotiations, they were going to shut down a plant in Illinois, I believe. And then during the negotiations, they agreed to keep it open and put something else in there. They can do this kind of stuff. They can be flexible. They don't have to destroy the lives of their workers. They can, in fact, keep production going and find these big companies have, I'd say, 100 different ways to rearrange their production process should they be committed to keeping their workers working. No compulsory layoffs. So I have a very simple solution. Easy. And I don't think it wouldn't touch competitiveness, global competitiveness. So this would be the third response to what I believed before. Right now, taxpayers provide $700 billion roughly in federal contracts, $700 billion that go to the private industry. I propose two simple clauses in those contracts. One, no compulsory layoffs. You can do voluntary layoffs, yes, but no compulsory layoffs during the life of the contract, and no stock buybacks. On the first one, I think the argument is the slogan. If taxpayers are paying for this contract, you shouldn't be laying off taxpayers during the life of the contract. And the second one is we shouldn't be giving you money so that you can turn around and do stock buybacks to enrich yourself. And this maintains sort of freedom. The company is not forced to do this. They don't have to take the federal money. Don't take the contract. Don't bid on the contract. Let somebody else take the contract. And I know for sure that corporations would abide by these agreements. And here's my example. It's an odd one, really. You remember Carrier air conditioning? And Trump, Pence made a big deal about keeping it open right after the 2016 election. And there was an interview with the president of United Technologies, the CEO, who they own Carrier, and they were the ones that were going to shut it down because they had 12 hedge funds who were pressuring them to do a $5 billion stock buyback, and they could save $60 million a year by moving Carrier to Mexico. And then they decided not to move all of it. More complicated about what happened. But the point is this. The CEO said the following. He goes, I was born at night, but not last night. 10% of our revenues come from the federal government. And what he was telling me and everybody else was, look, we're not about to upset the Trump administration because we want those contracts. So if no layoffs are part of that, what it takes to keep the money flowing in, we'll do what it takes. So I think corporations in America would definitely do what it takes to maintain that $700 billion, and compulsory layoffs would go crashing way down, and stock buybacks would stop being used as a way to lay off more workers.
I can picture conservative listeners hearing your response to that and just tearing out their hair, assuming they have, and he's saying, but even if the federal government can do that, it shouldn't, because it's horrible policy, because what happens if you tie the hands of businesses, then they're not able to essentially allow the system to reallocate labor from places it's needed less to places it's needed more. And that helps with the efficient operation of the system, which grows the economy for everyone. And what you're and people like you are proposing is basically putting these handcuffs on business to shrink the economy for everyone. It's going to be higher prices, less innovation. In the end, the jobs will go away anyway. Again, another argument I know you're familiar with.
You could make that argument if I were saying that across the board. But this is voluntary. This is a federal contract. This is not something, we're outside the free market here. This is government money going to corporations. Now, if you want to, we could have an argument about whether that should happen. Maybe there should just be public companies that are not private sector companies that do all the government work. But if we want to have the private sector, and this is a huge boost to the economy, right? This money coming into the private sector, we can put restrictions on it. Nobody has to take that contract. And I would beg to differ with you or with a conservative argument about the reallocation of resources that are taking place. If you're taking a $5 billion contract from the federal government, it's not unreasonable to expect you not to lay off workers to squeeze more money out of that contract. You should be able to plan. If you have a 1-year contract, you should be able to keep the workers working for 1 year. I mean, what kind of planner can't figure out how to do that? Otherwise, if you can't, don't take the money. You're obviously, your operation, you're free. I don't quite understand the argument about the reallocation of workers to other places all over the country. You have to explain to me how it is that stock buybacks are a good reallocation of money, because to pay for the stock buybacks, we're not seeing an efficient use of labor. We're seeing tossing people with whatever accumulated skills they have, just tossing them on the garbage heap. And what you're seeing is the argument that conservative argument has become the excuse for ever increasing gap between the top fraction of 1% and everybody else. And we have to address that. I'm trying to address it in the simplest, easiest way, a way that doesn't upset the apple cart, doesn't lead to deep federal interference in free enterprise. This is just saying, you want the federal money, you got to behave this way. Just like look, if we take a federal contract at the Labor Institute, we have to agree to a certain level of audits that's much higher than our normal audits. We have to go to an A133 audit. That's very burdensome on us. You know what? So we decide to not take a contract that puts us into an A133 audit position. That's just the way it goes. Audit conditions are something that the federal government should put on large contracts. So this is an audit condition. Don't lay anybody off during the life of the contract.
And so you don't really, it sounds like you don't buy the argument that by imposing these no layoff conditions on the federal contracts that it would significantly raise the cost to the contractors and then they would pass that on. And so, in other words, it'd be a less efficient allocation of taxpayer resources than otherwise without that. You don't think that argument
actually might do the opposite. It could increase competition as companies who are willing to do this would jump in to try to knock out the ones that are reluctant. There was a study just done that kind of undermines that argument that you were just making of federal defense contractors. And what they found was that instead of they were cutting back on R&D and cutting back on reinvestment in new plant and equipment and moving their money into stock buybacks. So it would increase efficiency, right? You want them to put money into new technology and R&D. It would increase efficiency if you said, no, you can't put money into stock buybacks while you have the contract. I was making an argument on this CHIPS money. See, look, it's one thing. I could see conservatives, and I would have an interesting conversation with them on this. If they want to say is there shouldn't be any federal subsidies at all. Okay, so we're giving Intel $8 billion in subsidies to build the chip plants in several different states. Now, what's going to stop them from putting the $8 billion that we give them into stock buybacks? In other words, well, there's a clause that says that they shouldn't, but it's a very weak clause, and the money is very fungible. And the only way, they're a big stock buyback company. The only way to stop them is to say, during the life, if you take this chip money, during the life of receiving this money, you can't do stock buybacks. Does Intel have to take the money? No. Somebody else could take the money. But it's a shame to not use federal money to do something that's important for society. Let's look at this the other way. The word efficiency is being used in a way that I don't think conservatives mean that they want to destroy people's livelihoods. But ever increasing job instability is basically harming the working class beyond comprehension, especially in rural areas. If a facility goes down because of really just profiteering in rural Pennsylvania, it's got 1,000 people there. Okay, now you and 1,000 of your neighbors and coworkers are racing around trying to find the last few jobs at the dollar store, at the local prison, the hospital, at Walmart. It's a miserable existence. And then you get that job and you're not sure how long it's going to last. You can't plan, you can't save. And in a free enterprise economy, the thing you need more than anything else is a stable job. Not that you need to have it for all your life, not that there aren't some bumps and bruises that you go through, but this churning of employment is accelerating. And even in industries that are doing well, in the high tech industry, that sector, last year, 2023, there were 270,000 jobs lost through layoffs, and over 70,000 so far this year. I think it's close to 80,000 now. And this is a booming sector. And many of those job losses are associated to the financing of stock buybacks. It doesn't have to be this way. And I see, once you have stock buybacks in the ballgame, the conversation about efficiency, forget about the human cost, just the economic cost. Just how is that efficient to put more money in stock buybacks than in R&D? Anyway, so I think we'll get to it shortly. But the impact on workers and their attitudes towards politics and towards democracy is something I think everyone ought to worry about. You're going to have an efficient economy. It may not be a democratic society anymore. People don't have stable employment.
I wanted to ask you about that because one of the many fascinating things I thought in the book was when you looked at how traumatic layoffs can really be. I mean, not just in terms of loss of income, but in a lot of other ways that I think a lot of people might not necessarily think of if they haven't been the victim, I guess you could say, or subject to one of these mass layoffs.
Well, it was again that was shocking to me as well. Losing your job is the seventh most stressful life event, ranked more stressful than divorce, a sudden and serious impairment of hearing or vision, or the death of a close friend. It takes over 2 years to recover from the trauma of job loss. It can impact the health of a fetus. It increases suicide rate. And this is the general health, and this isn't just due to, all of a sudden I'm depressed, I'm going to take opioids. No, we're talking just about the shock of having your life so disrupted. And if this has happened to 30 million people, and if you count in their families, we're talking about half the workforce has experienced this trauma. And the damn problem is, it's not even an issue. It's not on anybody's agenda, and therefore it's not being addressed, other than, you can get Medicaid once you get down and out enough. But, there's no transitional jobs programs. There's no effort to try to get rid of compulsory layoffs. Hey, by the way, in terms of free market, what's wrong with a voluntary layoff? What's wrong with, we do it with CEOs all the time. We give them golden parachutes of, hundreds of millions of dollars. What's wrong with trying to urge workers to leave by giving enough money so it's worth their while? I don't understand why that's inefficient.
I wanted to point that out because it's not just boo-hoo, these sensitive people need to toughen up. There are real economic costs associated with that. If people get sicker, they have to use the healthcare system, which increases costs. Even if you're like a sort of a cold-hearted, green eye shade, bottom line sort of person, you'd have to conclude that there are some pretty significant negative externalities here that aren't really being priced into all this, or at least that the companies aren't really taking care of.
Good point. I should have added that to the book. I'll have to get you to write that as an addendum to that healthcare chapter. But yes, the externalities are enormous. The ones that I became very involved in trying to think through the political externalities. I didn't think anybody was going to listen to the economic externalities, because we've been arguing about externalities, since the word came up 40 years ago, and it just goes right by. But the political externalities started to really concern me, and the question becomes, what's the impact of mass layoffs on the political system? And what we discovered was there's a statistically powerful, connection between the mass layoff rate. This is before Trump, between 1996 and 2012, the mass layoff rate in a given county, and the decline of the Democratic Party vote in the blue wall states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and the key states of Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, the swing states. And this is rock solid truth that the white working class counties, the whiter rural counties, had layoff rates on average of 33% during that period. A third of the workforce went through a mass layoff. And I'm talking about mass layoff. That's 50 or more people let go at the same time, not one person here or another person there. You got laid off because you were late 10 times that month or something. Now we're talking about a systematic layoff, mass layoff, as defined by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And if you rank the counties in terms of mass layoff rates, as the mass layoff rate went down, the Democratic Party vote went up. So there was a rebellion against the Democratic Party that's connected to mass layoffs. So that was our first big discovery, but we had to deal with something else to make that discovery stick. And this became our second discovery. There are a lot of people that would argue, and there's books out on it, and Hillary Clinton made it famous, that no, the reason these people are abandoning the Democratic Party is that they're basically deplorables. She said, right, they said half the Trump vote were people who were homophobic, xenophobic, sexist, racist, and so on. And so now we're still talking about 1996 to 2012. So this would be right through the Obama administration, black president and all that. Are these workers rebelling against the Democrats because of the mass layoff rate or because of this deplorableness, being illiberal, growing illiberal? Well, there are these incredibly robust voter survey databases. Robust, but I mean 50,000, 100,000, up to 500,000 responses to a series of questions. And there are three of these databases, and we selected 23 hot button issue questions. I mean, very divisive questions. And we wanted to see what happened over time in the responses. Let me just read you one question. Should gay or lesbian couples be permitted to adopt children? In the year 2000, only 38.2% of the white working class agreed. You know what it is as of 2020? 76%. Overwhelming majority agree. Here's another one about same-sex sex between two consenting adults is always wrong. That fell from 60% to 29%. And this is the one that really caught my attention because we do a lot of work with immigrant workers. Do you favor granting legal status to all illegal immigrants? They use the word illegal in the question. Immigrants who have held jobs and paid taxes for at least 3 years and have not been convicted of any felony crimes. This one starts in 2010, this question. At that point, 2010, only 32% agreed with that legalization. By 2020, this is after Trump, 61.8% agreed. This is white working class.
So yes.
And
so then basically it seems like your argument is that this whole line of thinking that, well, the Democratic Party is losing the white working class because of cultural issues doesn't seem nearly as convincing as the argument that the Democratic Party is losing the white working class because it stopped standing up for the white working class.
Economically, yes. That's the argument we're making. It's a very hard argument to get out because believe it or not, I was being interviewed by Newt Gingrich, who very much liked the book. And afterwards, we were talking about, how to get the book out further. And he says, I can see why you're going to have trouble with the New York Times because they are promoting the illiberal, deplorable argument, and they're shy about dealing with the economic argument. And he says, and with the Wall Street Journal, it'll just be reversed. And he says, it's so counterintuitive right now because so much time and effort has been spent on talking about the culture wars. And the assumption is that, all those people on January 6th, that's the white working class. By the way, we did some work on that as well. And there's a study done of who those people are. They are disproportionately white collar, disproportionately business owners. And there are fewer blue collar workers in that demonstration than there are in the population as a whole. But once again, it looks like these are the masses rising. And so, and this becomes an excuse. See, if you're a corporate-oriented politician, a corporate-oriented Democrat, this is a perfect excuse to not worry about the jobs of white working-class people anymore, or working-class people in general, because you've shifted your focus towards other things. You don't want to take on Wall Street. And that's where I think the big problem is. Both the Democrats and Republicans, starting in the 80s, really, late 80s, began competing with each other for the favor of Wall Street because that's where the money was going and that's where you could get campaign contributions. And also that's where in the future, your staff might get very good jobs. And these people seem very smart and leading the economy forward and so on. And it became very difficult to do anything to regulate them. It took an enormous financial crash even to get some re-regulation of the big banks. But, the hedge funds and private equity entities are still not regulated. They call it the shadow banking community. They have enormous amount of wealth that they can throw around, and the two parties are competing for that wealth. And Democrats are fearful if they come out, except for it's interesting, Sherrod Brown is cutting it the other way, but too many Democrats, I believe, have decided not to go to war with Wall Street, and as a result, the war on workers continues. And very few politicians, Bernie Sanders can do this, and people from blue states can talk about this, but Sherrod Brown's in a red state now, and he's talking about it. And it works because once you act as if you address white working class people as if they're not deplorables and start talking about mass layoffs and job instability, you will get their attention and you will have their respect because you're respecting them. I don't know if you saw this. One of the most profound examples of this chaos is a little county in West Virginia called Mingo County. And I chose to look at it for two reasons. One is it lost the most jobs, coal jobs, of any county in the country between 1996 and 2020. Lost 3,000 jobs. The county only went from 3,300 to 300 jobs. It only has 25,000 people in the county, less than that now, 22,000. It's also the home, almost the birthplace of the United Mine Workers in the early 20th century. There were the coal wars took place there. Mother Jones spoke there. It became an occupied zone. It was literally a war, a shooting war with airplanes dropping bombs, the whole thing. And it became occupied all the way till the New Deal. And then Roosevelt basically recognized unions and the mine workers were able to finally organize without threat of violence, and standard of living went up for these workers, and they became fervent Democrats. Bill Clinton in 1996 got 69.7% of the vote in Mingo County. 1996. 3,000 coal jobs lost later, Biden got 13.9%. And why did they take it out on the Democrats? Well, think about what exactly did the Democrats do? What they didn't do, and this is the other thing that got left off the agenda after 1980. Traditionally, the Democrats, when they saw a job crisis, they created public jobs. That's what the New Deal did. Even Jimmy Carter did that in the CETA program in 1978 during that recession, created 700,000 jobs almost overnight, public jobs. Your conservative listeners would say make work jobs, but they created the jobs. Nothing was created in Mingo County from the public sector. And it would have been so easy to do it. It would have been easy to go around and say, okay, what do we need here? Well, the roads are a mess. Schools need to be rebuilt. The mountaintop removal of the coal mines have to be, huge reclamation project. The streams, are polluted, have to be fixed up. There was an environmental restoration that could have taken place. Could have put internet, could have put people to work very rapidly. Didn't do any of it. Left it to the private sector. And you know what the private sector did? Actually, they're very inventive. Two drugstores began competing with each other to put out opioid prescriptions. And they were putting out, they got some doctor, several hours away to agree to let them use their names on prescriptions, and a nurse filling them out. They were putting out one prescription per minute. One of the drugstores ranked number 22 in the country, in a county of 22,000 people, in opioid prescriptions. People were lining up in a 5-state area, were lining up there to get their drugs. And so step back for a second. Let's say you are son of a laid off coal miner, and you're still living there. are you about to reward the Democrats for this? All right? You're gonna look for something else. You're gonna be what I've been calling this for years is you're going to engage in a political act of defiance. You want people to hear you, and voting against the Democrats was the best way to do that in people's minds. I mean, you don't have many choices. Anyway, so I think there's a book out now called White Rural Rage, which is just Hillary Clinton all over again and worse. It's not just working class people; all rural people are basically deplorables, and it's like kicking somebody when they're down. It's like, why are you picking on these people? Why aren't we having a conversation with the conservative people that you're listening, that are part of your listening audience, about how best to develop rural countryside, how best to create productive, useful jobs for America that are stable and that make for a more vibrant free enterprise economy, not one that is destructive, and also one that supports the democratic system, not one that undermines it. And right now, you're seeing people turn off more and more. You can't be happy about a democracy that can't deliver stable employment. And we're not talking about guaranteed lifetime employment. We're just talking about slowing this down. Instead of accelerating mass layoffs, slow it down. And these large corporations, the efficiency argument can't be true. If Siemens survives, if Stellantis survives, and they're able to make adjustments and decisions to keep plants open, put other products in, et cetera, it can be done. And it should be done for the sake of working people. All of us need a relatively stable job to survive in this economy. Otherwise, you're going to have people saying, hey, I want that strong man to come here and help put me to work. I'm tired of being pushed around like this. So I think it's time to at least have a national debate about mass layoffs. I welcome the attacks from conservatives. I was ready for Newt Gingrich to come at me, and he didn't. He agreed that this was a problem. I was shocked. So I want your conservative listeners to debate this. I think airing it publicly, widely, is exactly what we should be doing. If people have better solutions, I'm open to them. And so will the working people in this country.
I think there are some folks on the right who would say, but is there really that much of a problem in the first place? For instance, if you take a look at BLS data, layoffs overall, not just mass layoffs, are actually down over the last couple of decades. From 2001 to 2012, they averaged around 1.5% of the workforce, and that's gone down to 1.3% of the workforce in the last decade or so. And that even includes that, high layoff COVID year of 2020. And someone could look at that and say, well, look at the unemployment rate. It's at practically historic lows. So is this even a problem that needs to be solved with any kind of regulation or anything like that? And what's your response to that sort of argument?
Yeah, this is the argument I've been having with Paul Krugman, although he's not responding. Which is, I think macro data is irrelevant. 1.2 versus 1.5% is still an enormous number of people out of 150 million working people. And if that number is this constant year after year after year, it goes up and down a little bit, you've got enormous amount of job churning, and you've got people having their lives tremendously disrupted. I mean, how is it that 40% of the population, according to the Fed, can't handle a $400 emergency? What is that? That has to have something to do with job instability. And second thing, the unemployment rate, look, it would be worse if the unemployment rate was high, but it doesn't mean that the job that you are able to stumble into next is A, decent paying, and B, stable. So you're just bouncing from basically down the SES scale for most people. And that's not a way to live your life. And the third thing is, very few of the people who make this argument, not including you in this, have any experience with what it's like to go through a mass layoff. I mean, people who have a high level of skills that and unique skills, like a columnist from the New York Times and a Nobel laureate, he's not going to run into a mass layoff problem.
Yeah, right.
And therefore, the macro statistics, like he's puzzled. Krugman is puzzled. Why aren't the American people, especially these, deplorables, why aren't they giving Biden credit for all the good things they're doing for them? And what he doesn't see, and what most people don't see about the infrastructure bill, is the infrastructure bill does create immediate employment for the building trades, but the long-term employment is going to be for somebody else. I give you a perfect example. I was talking to these workers who lost their job at Siemens in Olean, New York, which is on the southern tier of New York, right above Pennsylvania, near Corning. Used to be a very heavily industrial area. It's less so. 500 workers. Well, they're going to build a new chips plant, I believe, up in Buffalo. A long way to Buffalo. So they're not going to, and they got to eat between now and 3 years from now when the actual production jobs start. So, they scrambled around and, found jobs within a couple hours. And I think most of them, more or less, they got a nice severance package and, they're there, but they're not happy. And they're not, the infrastructure bill doesn't mean a whole lot to them. And it doesn't mean a whole lot to people who, who are never going to get those jobs. So you have to break through. Look, I like big picture macro discussions, but you have to ground them in what people are actually experiencing. And what these economists are doing is they're saying, well, look at all this good stuff, and people aren't appreciating it. It must be the deplorables, right? It must be the culture wars. They're voting against their own interests. That's right. They're always voting against their own interests, and it's their fault. And I don't think they are voting against their own interests. They are protesting against the lack of any coherent program that will slow down mass layoffs, not even being discussed.
I wonder if part of the reason for this, if we kind of look back historically, I feel like in the past, it was easier for Democratic politicians to resist Wall Street because they had union support. Unions 40 years ago, something like a quarter of U.S. workers are represented by a union. It's just over 11% today. And so we don't have that sort of strong counterweight to corporate interest, to Wall Street money that Democrats, that other people who want to help out workers can rely on. And I guess I'm wondering, why do you think that unions have declined so precipitously? And would you agree that that's a big part of the problem in terms of fighting for workers' rights?
Yeah, I don't think your conservative listeners are going to like your point of view there, but I agree with it entirely. There has been, you see, there were a lot of things about the 50s and 60s during that era, as you said, less global competition. But one of the biggest factors was, the unionization rate in the private sector was 35% in 1955. Now it's 6%. So there's been, that allowed, there's great stuff when you read some interesting things back then. There was a hearing in Congress on automation, and the big fear then was World War II was the colossal jump forward in automation. I mean, there's a labor shortage. Even with women going into the workplace, there was still an enormous labor shortage, and they figured out how to increase production dramatically. And so there was a lot of discussion about how are we going to deal with, surplus time, and, labor was worried about automation. They had these hearings in Washington, and you could see corporations came in, they were one entity, the government was another entity, and labor was another entity. And you could a discussion was underway about should the product of all this good new technology be used to increase worldly goods, increase wages, reduced work time. There were all these possibilities that were being seriously discussed. Now that there's no discussion, right? It just whatever corporations want to do, that's what they're going to do. So that the society became terribly unbalanced. The reasons why this took place are complex, and we might need a whole nother podcast on that. And something I've looked at, but it starts. Labor got rid of its best organizers during the Red Scares, starting in the late 40s through the 1950s. They basically cleaned out the left wing, who were the most committed organizers. And there's, one can make an argument that some of that was inevitable, but whatever. The next thing, I think, even more as destructive, or maybe more destructive, was the Vietnam War. That the leadership of the AFL-CIO were hawks supreme. George Meany, they worked hand in glove with the CIA, with the State Department to prosecute the Cold War around the globe. And when we took over from the French in Vietnam, they fully backed it. And now you had a new phenomena which hadn't existed in the labor movement for quite a while, which was that people were being sent out to die, kind of. And there were a lot of people in the rank and file that didn't like this, and they were upset that their union leaders were not being more dovish. Some were. It was very divided. The country got very divided, and I think the labor movement suffered dramatically during this period. They also had their own internal problems with democracy. I touch on this in the book. I list 4 or 5 things, but you're absolutely right. Labor went down, but it also went down because the Reagan basically, it started well before Reagan, but Reagan basically said, look, the government's not going to protect unions. That's what the PATCO, the air traffic controllers strike, was all about. Yes, public sector strikes are illegal, and usually what happens is they settle and then they find the union something and life goes on. He basically fired them and replaced them. And up until this point, private sector unions, companies had not been using replacement workers. They had not been firing workers who were on strike. And now they started to basically just eliminate union workers. They could move rapidly. They could merge. All things that were controlled and slowed down by various federal agencies before this were now deregulated. And this made it much easier to wipe out unions. And it went down. 6% is not a big percentage right now.
So where we are today, right? I mean, I think for people who are maybe left of center, the best plausible outcome in November's elections, right, is Joe Biden gets reelected. The Democrats maybe have a small House majority. The Senate somehow miraculously stays 50-50 with Vice President Harris giving, the Democrats a tie-breaking vote. So the thinnest of margins, right? And so given how thin the margins are, what do you think is the most optimistic? Because I'd like to close on an optimistic note. Given political realities and those divisions, what do you see as the sort of most optimistic expectations that we might have for ways to do some of the things that you think should be done in real world politics?
Well, that's a great question. Let me go at it short term and medium term. Short term, before the election, the Democratic platform should basically call for the prohibition of stock buybacks and no forced layoffs in federal contracts. I think that would go a long way to getting the attention of working people if they did that, especially the no forced layoffs in federal contracts. That would be music to the ears of working people. I think it would help get that margin. And you're being optimistic, thinking that, all these margins. I mean, I'm fearful. But let's say somehow we get through this. What I'd like to see happen, and what I think could happen, I think someone like Shawn Fain, now this is my optimistic note, he's president of the UAW, who for the first time since Tony Mazzocchi, who was the labor leader in the Oil, Chemical, Atomic Workers, the first time since Mazzocchi that I've heard a labor leader talk class politics as opposed to just his workers, his or her workers, his or her industry. But I mean, broad class politics. When he has a T-shirt on that says "Eat the Rich," or he says, there shouldn't be billionaires, he has a very good understanding of the big picture problem of working people. I'd like to see him set up a new political organization called Workers United Against Mass Layoffs for non-union workers. And so in addition to him organizing, the UAW organizing auto plants in the South, and hopefully they will be successful, they could ride that success to all workers across the country, to the other 94% who are not in unions, and say, join us, $1 a month, something cheap. Here's an organization that's going to put your problem on the national agenda. We're going to fight against mass layoffs, and we're going to have a political organization that's going to do it, and we're going to lead it because we have the resources to do this and the organizers. I think people would come running to that organization. And once political parties see that, you watch. I would predict rapidly the issue of mass layoffs / stock buybacks would jump into the political agenda because they'd be worried that who are these people going to work for if they get mobilized by somebody like Shawn Fain? But it's going to take a Shawn Fain and maybe some other allies like in the Communication Workers of America, SEIU, and some other progressive unions. But he's got the profile right now that could do this. He could just say, join me, join us, Workers United Against Mass Layoffs. Anyway, I've been trying to get this message to him. I make sure that my Substack pieces get to him. And I hope that we need somebody to step forward. Years ago, this guy Mazzocchi started something called Labor Party Advocates. And it was remarkable how many people wanted to join that really rapidly. And this, a Labor Party isn't going to work right now. But Workers United Against Mass Layoffs, that would work. Because you're not promising a political party. You're focusing on an issue that's absolutely vital to virtually every worker in every sector. I mean, there's very few people who aren't worried about mass layoffs or getting stuck in one. Anyway, that's my optimistic note. I think it can be built. I think it should be built. And I think it would help change the country for the better.
Well, I always like to close on an optimistic note, so thanks for providing it. Leslie Paul, it's been great talking with you again. The book is Wall Street's War on Workers. It's full of great stuff. I think you should check it out.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you're not already a supporter of the show, I hope you'll consider becoming one because without our supporters, we wouldn't be able to do this. And when you become a supporter, you get not just that warm, fuzzy feeling, knowing that you're supporting a good cause. I like to think we're a good cause, but you also get stuff like ad-free versions of everything we put out. You get our supporter exclusive midweek show, the full length of that, not just the preview. And you also get to be part of our Discord group if you want. And there's always some interesting conversations going on there. At the $10 a month level or more, you get to actually be part of the episodes Jay and I do, if that's something you're interested in. So there's a lot of stuff is what I am saying. And I hope you'll consider checking it out. And to do that, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys. If you want to support us on Venmo, we're at Politics Guys. You can also support the show through PayPal. And all of our support links are always in the show notes, as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And as always, I want to close with a very special thank you to our wonderful executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,